The society was amazingly successful in the 16th and 17th century in comparison, for instance, with the other orders that were founded at the same time. Why was this? I mean, like the Barnabites and the Samasci and the Theatines. Why was this? Well, I think one reason for sure is that the society was international from the very beginning. So first of all, they're in Paris. There were Basques, Navarrese, Portuguese, Savoyard, and they were in a foreign place, and then they moved to a foreign place. They moved to Italy, whereas the other orders were founded by Italians. They were in Italy, and they had a more limited scope. And even the Capuchins, founded in Italy, and grew to a size. It was a huge Capuchin sort of population. It took them a while to move out of Italy. So I think that is one factor, the international character of the Jesuits from the beginning, which also gave them an international outlook. And it's significant that Xavier was on his way to India before the society was officially approved in September 27, 1540. So point number one. Point number two, they had this new ministry of running these schools, which gave them an attractiveness and a sense of something new that I think brought really very talented people to the society and influenced all their ministries, because the schools were not simply schools, but they were also the headquarters, you might say, for all the ordinary ministries that the society engaged in. And then, of course, there were other houses outside the schools who did those things. But that's special to the society, and I think helped make it successful. And it was kind of this unlimited scope of what Jesuits might do and engage in. The Church of St. Ignatius in Rome is interesting because the architect was a Jesuit by the name of Orazio Grassi, who was a teacher of rhetoric. He was also an architect and also a very accomplished musician, but taught rhetoric at the Collegio Romano and was an architect. He had scope for that aspect of his talent and training. Also, for instance, in terms of painting and architecture, so much of that was done by the temporal coadjutors, the brothers. These men were often full-fledged, highly respected professionals when they entered. They did not have a literary education, but they had a wonderful professional education. For instance, the Tristano brothers, who entered in the 1550s while Ignatius was still alive, they came from a very respected architectural family in Ferrara. And why were these professionals especially attracted to the society? Yeah. I think maybe one reason was we did not have choir. So we did not have a distinction between, say, the choir Jesuits and the others, whereas in the mendicant orders you had the priest members spent a lot of the day in choir. That was just for the priests. Whereas here, there was a kind of equality. I mean, it certainly was a big distinction between the layman and the priest. Nonetheless, I think that may be one reason why they were attracted to the society. We had such a wonderful instrument of government in the constitutions. It was firm about principles and about sort of general orientation, but extremely flexible in the way it would be implemented. It's one of those documents that, as I've often said, is filled with escape clauses. We will behave in this way, we'll do these things unless something else seems better. So again, there was a kind of, I think, a built-in institutional flexibility that was important in making the society successful. The correspondence, another special feature of the society, this this regular correspondence between center and periphery, which meant that information was diffused and innovations, how people were accomplishing certain things was diffused, and that also helped for successful operation. You could say, oh, that's what they're doing in Italy, and maybe we could do this down here in Brazil, make an adaptation and see how it works. So I think those are some reasons, at least, why the society grew to be such a large religious order and such an influential one, and was, in worldly terms even, so successful. The constitutions are a special document in the history of religious life. I don't think that we really appreciate how novel they were. If you look at the rules and even the constitutions of the orders, religious orders up to that time, what you basically find is rules. That is to say, individual ordinances or regulations, often of a very specific and almost pedestrian type. Our habit is of wool, not of linen. At matins, we bow 3 times before the second lesson. Collections of things along this line. And what do we have for our main meal? What's allowed for the main meal in the dining room? And what are the exceptions for the Lenten season? What are the exceptions for the Easter season? It's that kind of a collection of regulations. Constitutions, it breaks with that tradition altogether. It's a document that has a beginning, middle, and end. There's a psychological structure to it. You sort of follow the Jesuit from before entrance to training, to final vows, and up to basically becoming general, because that last section there on the general, the ninth part on the general's sort of portrait of the ideal Jesuit. Here are the qualities the general should have. That's kind of a portrait of the ideal Jesuit, it seems to me. So it has this completely new structure. It's an overloaded document. I mean, they should have cleaned it up because it's too much there. It's too specific for the constitutions. A lot of this should have been in a bylaws, as we would say today, that because, I mean, for instance, that the theology course should begin with Peter Lombard. Well, I don't think that was observed even from almost the time before the ink was dry on the constitutions, because they began to move beyond Peter Lombard. So it needs to be cleaned up. It's very difficult to read. But if you look at the basic structure, it is really remarkable and unlike anything up to that time. Moreover, it is based on, and there's an implicit theology there. And again, it's a theology of reconciliation. Because when talking about the education of the Jesuits, there's this acknowledgement of the use of non-Christian sources as being helpful and appropriate for them. And very explicitly, the Jesuits should use the human means as well as the spiritual means. And so there is this implicit spirituality, theology that's in it, that's not in correlative documents of the other religious orders. What else? Let's see. Oh, yes. It has that wonderful preamble, which it reminds people that it's the interior law of charity that the Holy Spirit is accustomed to print in the hearts of the faithful. That's really what this is all about. So it recalls us to that fundamental principle. Therefore, kind of, in some ways, it relativizes the constitutions and the regulations of the constitutions. It sets up ideals. As I mentioned, the qualities that the general should have, they're really portraits. They're holding up ideals. He should be magnanimous, for instance, and eager to undertake great causes and not to be discouraged by problems that occur. To be a person of prayer, a person of solid virtue, and so forth. So it's really a very, when looked at in the round, when looked at in a global way, it's an innovation really in the history of documentation pertaining to religious life. From the very earliest days, the Jesuits, Ignatius, Polanco, Nadal, used the expression noster modus procedendi, our way of proceeding. And it's a very pregnant phrase, I think. Often what they meant by that was simply some rather pedestrian procedures. We Jesuits, when traveling, if one of them gets sick, the other will, one of them will stay behind to tend for the person while the others continue on their journey and so forth. So it can mean even something like the pedestrian sort of traffic regulations, even in the house, but on a larger, then you can kind of move up the scale. And Polanco has an expression once in a letter, he says, well, our way of proceeding is orderly, and it's also reflective, and it's spiritual. So we're kind of moving up the scale there a little bit. I think that Nadal hit the nail on the head and moving to the higher level when he said, our way is spiritu corde et practice, in and from the Spirit, that is to say, from the inspiration of grace. Not Pelagian, right? Not doing it ourselves, but under the impulse of God's inspiration. Corde, from the heart and to the heart. So this affect, and again, not simply behavior modification to get Christians to do their duties, which they wanted them to do, which was important for them to do, but to do them from the inside out, if you will. That's, of course, what the spiritual exercises are all about. And then practice, practically, but practically now meaning, it seems to me, pastorally, that is to say, for the good of souls. As I've said many times, what has struck me in working on those documents from Ignatius and his correspondence in preparing for the first Jesuits, writing the first Jesuits, the expression that appears on, I'd say, every page equivalently is not for the greater glory of God, although that occurs so often in the constitutions and was extremely important, but the help of souls. So the society is about help. And it's about helping the church. It's about helping Christians. It's about helping people to their eternal salvation. It's about helping in this world, but practice, in that sense, pastorally. And that's what seems to me that's kind of a high level of what our way of proceeding is. And you can keep at, then you can begin to even analyze it further. The whole discernment aspect of it. It's part of the orderly procedure. It's part of the spiritu, that it's done under the inspiration of grace. So you can add that to it, of course. And but the spiritual exercises being the basic framework behind our way of proceeding. What about Ignatius on the vows, the poverty, chastity, and obedience? The one line in the constitutions that it's to be nothing needs to be said because it's obvious that it's to be observed as fully and perfectly as possible. Let's talk about that vow for a moment. There's very little directly in the sources about that vow. I mean, they were very discreet. I mean, when they'll be talking about why a person was dismissed, they'll sometimes say, and for other grave causes. Well, I mean, the dirty mind thinks that has something to do with sex. And it probably does, because they were very reluctant to talk about this in any direct way. And that was typical enough of the age. I mean, that was typical enough of especially religious people in religious life. And there were these regulations about those rules for modesty, not to touch one another. This rule of touch, I mean, that was not just sort of a bit of sort of politeness, but that was related to chastity. There was this regulation, too, as one of the things in the society never got in the rules, but when they were traveling, they were together, they were to avoid sleeping in the same bed. So they weren't naive about this issue at all. I mean, in terms of, homosexual possibilities, but in general, dealing with the opposite sex. Worry about hearing women's confessions. This becomes sort of a preoccupation after a while. All the care that had to be exercised, and they should not go to the homes of women, even noble women, to hear their confessions unless accompanied by a companion. So they were aware of it. And talking about beyond that, I don't know of any single instructions on chastity. I think poverty and obedience are interesting in that in the beginning with Ignatius, these are vows now that you have to discuss because you might say that chastity, what the Jesuits thought and felt and believed about chastity was incumbent upon all Christians up to a certain level, but certainly on all Christians who were not married. So all celibates, male and female. But with poverty and obedience, no, there's a lot of room here for maneuver. I mean, obedience in the Society of Jesus is not going to be the same as obedience in a Carthusian monastery. And poverty is not going to be the same as Franciscan poverty. So there's a lot of discussion about that. What I find interesting is that, I think this is right, with Ignatius, concerned though he was about poverty, he was much more concerned about this and much more of a preoccupation with him in the beginning than towards the end. What becomes more of a preoccupation towards the end is obedience. Because why? It's obvious. He's dealing with this big, sprawling, not yet cohesive organization. And how obedience is one way of holding things together. So it's no wonder that he's more preoccupied with that towards the end than he is with poverty. And with the schools, how that changed the whole poverty issue. Because at the beginning, the presupposition was that most of the houses of the society would be professed houses or the equivalent of professed houses, and therefore would have no fixed income. And Ignatius, was very concerned about this and prayed over it and shed tears over it, came to a decision. De facto, by the time he died, most Jesuits were living, this including professed, were living in colleges. And these colleges were endowed. The original idea of a college was this would be a residence for Jesuits studying at a university. So scholastics. By the time he died, the colleges might contain some scholastics who were studying, contain more who were what we would say doing regency, but these were some of them fairly large now institutions whose student body was exclusively or principally lay students, and that's where most Jesuits were living, and therefore most Jesuits were living in houses that not only could have an endowment, but were supposed to have an endowment so that they could function. So again, we have to look at this difference between, read the constitutions about institutional poverty, and then you see what the lived reality was by the time Ignatius died, and with his obvious approval. Polanco has a line in a letter to, I forget who it is, to somebody in Spain. It's about 1554, something like that. And in answer to a query, he says, "It is our Father's wish that for the present at least it be the colleges that multiply, not the houses." So there you go. So poverty, chastity, and obedience, they very interesting in how they're configured in the early society.